Over the course of wrestling's history, the question has often been asked, what's the greatest storyline of all time? To some, the answer to this will stretch back to the territory days for angles like Dusty Rhodes' battles with the Four Horsemen, the Von Erichs being forced to defend their promotion from the Fabulous Freebirds, or Andy Kaufman's time down in Memphis battling Jerry Lawler. For others, it'll be something far more modern, such as the story of the Yes Movement, the Mega Powers explosion, or the birth of the NWO. That said, for our money, there's one story which stands above everything else as the greatest of all time, and that's Stone Cold Steve Austin's war with Vince McMahon in the late 90s. Yes, the battle between the Boss and his top guy raging against the Machine has become arguably the iconic feud in WWE history. But how did it all happen? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into the entire story from start to finish in Austin vs. McMahon, Wrestling's Greatest Rivalries, Episode 1. It all started at August 3, 1997's SummerSlam. That's when Steve Austin, who by this point was the fastest rising babyface the company had seen in years on account of his Man of the People fighting redneck character, would win the Intercontinental title from Owen Hart. Unfortunately for him, however, during the course of this bout, a botched piledriver would see him suffer a legit broken neck, and so, in the weeks which followed, he'd be forced to vacate his title and step away from in-ring competition. Of course, the person responsible for making this decision was CEO of WWF, Vince McMahon. And while he had only been portrayed as a commentator on screen prior to this, it would be around here that, as part of his on-screen beefs with the likes of Stone Cold and Bret Hart, he'd start to be acknowledged as the actual boss behind the scenes. That said, even if he was the man in charge, he was finding it difficult to deal with his newest babyface star, as with the Rattlesnake being anxious to get back in the ring and get his revenge on Owen Hart, he'd begin taking out his frustrations on different WWF officials every week. And this would all lead to the September 22nd episode of Raw that year, where in the ultimate defiant act, Austin would deliver a stone-cold stunner to his boss, with this drawing a massive reaction from the packed New York crowd in attendance at Madison Square Garden. So with all this momentum built up during his time away then, once the fan favorite was cleared to return to the ring soon after that, it wouldn't be long before he'd entered the world title picture. And that was because, after winning the Royal Rumble in January of 1998, he'd book himself a shot at the top prize at WrestleMania 14. One person who was not happy with this, however, was Vince McMahon, as, still holding a grudge over the stunner his employee had given him months before, he felt Austin would represent a public relations nightmare should he ever become the champion. But by then, any fans that had been on Vince's side prior to this were no longer with him, because following the events of the Montreal Screwjob in November of 1997, he'd have turned himself full heel with the way he handled the exit of Bret Hart. So with Austin being the working-class hero to the people everywhere, and McMahon representing all that was evil about corporate America, it felt natural the two were going to clash sooner or later. And this clash would formally begin the night after the Rattlesnake beat Shawn Michaels for the WWF title at WrestleMania, as on the March 30th, 1998 episode of Raw, the new champ would step in the ring with the Boss as the two tried their best to put the growing tensions between them to bed. Of course, the way McMahon saw it, the only way to do this was for Austin to become a more corporate champion, with this meaning he would have to cut out the bad language, drinking on the job, and overall renegade attitude he'd developed going forward. Needless to say, though, Stone Cold had no time for this, and so, instead of bending the knee to his employer, he'd deliver yet another Stone Cold stunner to him, a decision which formally kicked off the feud between the two. And with the start of this program, WWF would go full mainstream once again, as people all over the world found it easy to get invested in the idea of someone wanting to beat up their boss. But while Austin was the perfect anti-hero babyface for his era here, it would never have worked had Vince not been so great at playing the Machiavellian villain too, something he went fully in on over the weeks which followed as he continually tried to get one over on his champion. In fact, on the April 13th episode of Raw, it even looked like the two were going to meet one-on-one in the ring at one point, as after Austin laid down the challenge to the Boss at the start of the show, McMahon would feel he had no choice but to accept. That said, while this would lead to WWF having their first ratings win in 83 weeks, it would all prove to be a red herring in the end, as, before the two could lock up, Dude Love would come down to the ring and lay the champ out, from there revealing he had aligned himself with the devil. Yes, Vince knew he couldn't beat the Rattlesnake in a physical fight, so in lieu of this, he'd start selecting a number of hand-picked surrogates who he hoped would get the job done for him and get the title off this redneck menace. And with Foley being the first of these, it meant he'd get his shot at Austin at April 26th's Unforgiven in Your House. But while Dude Love represented a major enough hurdle for the new champ as it was here, he would also have to contend with Vince McMahon being at ringside and holding the lingering threat over him that he may screw him the same way he had Bret Hart before. So maybe this was why, as the bout was drawing to a close, Stone Cold would have accidentally laid out McMahon with a steel chair. Of course, any claims that he hadn't done this on purpose wouldn't wash with the boss. No, instead he'd come to believe his now heated rival knew exactly what he was doing, and so, the following month, things would be made even more difficult for him. But how would this play itself out? Well, in the rematch between Austin and Dude Love at May 31st's Over the Edge in Your House, not only would McMahon himself be the special guest referee, but his personal stooges Gerald Briscoe and Pat Patterson would serve as guest timekeeper and ring announcer respectively. Luckily then, the Rattlesnake had an equalizer here, because before the bout could begin, The Undertaker would come out to even the odds for the babyface side. And when he had to take out Patterson and Briscoe once they tried to get involved later on then, it would be left to Austin to get the victory when he used Vince McMahon's limp arm to count the fall himself. And why was Vince's body limp at this point? Well, he'd been laid out with a steel chair again, though this time not by Austin himself, but inadvertently by the very man he'd handpicked to dethrone the champion. So with it being clear that Dude Love wasn't working after that, the boss would decide to go a different direction the following month, as in the lead-up to the June 28th King of the Ring, he'd named WWF's resident horror movie villain Kane as the new #1 contender. And in an added wrinkle to the whole thing, this one would be contested under First Blood rules. But with the Big Red Machine being almost covered from head to toe in clothing, it meant the Rattlesnake was at a distinct disadvantage here. And despite putting in a valiant effort, in the end he would lose the title to Kane at King of the Ring, though only after The Undertaker interfered and busted him open with an accidental chair shot to the head. Of course, the next night on Raw, however, Austin would be able to execute his rematch clause so as to get another shot at the new champ, and here, despite McMahon's best efforts, he would be able to regain it and make himself a two-time champion. Still, even if he had been foiled once again, the boss knew exactly what he needed to do to get the belt off of his rival, because despite The Undertaker still feigning innocence when it came to being aligned with his kayfabe brother, Vince felt he could see right through this. And so that was why, after Austin successfully defended the belt against the Deadman at August 30th SummerSlam, his employer would decide his next challenge would see him go up against both The Undertaker and Kane in a triple threat match. Yes, even the Rattlesnake could see he was screwed here, especially as in the weeks leading up to the bout at September 27th's Breakdown in Your House, it would be revealed that the Brothers of Destruction were indeed in cahoots. So being forced to defend his belt in what was effectively a handicap match then, the champ would have little hope of coming out the winner. But while he would end up losing here, much to the delight of Vince McMahon, the circumstances of the finish would see the title be held up as vacant, as both Kane and The Undertaker had pinned Stone Cold at the same time. Not that this mattered to the now former champion though, because all he cared about was getting his revenge on the boss. And this would see him interrupt Vince while he was in the ring the next night on Raw by driving a Zamboni down the aisle and then leaping off of it to beat him up. But even if he did get some measure of revenge here, McMahon still held all the cards. And that was why, at October 18th's Judgment Day in Your House, he'd named Austin as the special guest referee in the match between the Brothers of Destruction for the vacant world title. Of course, should the Rattlesnake choose not to play ball and call the bout fairly here, the boss had promised to fire him on the spot. And despite him having been so hesitant to get rid of his rival in the months prior on account of how much money he was making for him, by the time Stone Cold laid out both participants and declared himself the winner, Vince would have no choice but to lay down the law and tell him, "You're fired." That said, this was far from the end of the story here, because the very next night on Raw, Austin would return to the show with a rifle in hand, seemingly ready to hunt and shoot his now former boss. Once he got him in the ring and on his knees though, he would reveal that this had only been an attempt to scare him, something which was so successful, the boss would actually urinate himself on live TV. And once he was done being humiliated with this, Stone Cold would stick a copy of a contract in his pocket. A contract which had been signed by Shane McMahon and stated the Rattlesnake had been reinstated. Why was this? Well, at this point in time, Shane disagreed with his father's villainous ways, and so felt the best way to stick it to him was to hire back his chief rival. And that wasn't all he did either, because as per the terms of the new contract, at November 18th Survivor Series, Austin would get to take part in the one-night tournament for the still vacant WWF title. That said, at some point between the Texans' reinstatement and Survivor Series, the McMahons would reunite in secret. And this would lead to a situation where, during the semifinals of the Deadly Game tournament later that month, Shane would refuse to count for the Rattlesnake when he had Mankind beat, something which led to him getting eliminated only moments later. Yes, like Bret Hart the year prior, Steve Austin had been screwed at the Survivor Series. And to make matters worse, a new hand-picked corporate champion had now been chosen to usurp him, as by the end of the show, The Rock was standing tall. So now, with no more avenues towards getting a title shot, Austin would have to wait until the Royal Rumble in January 24th, 1999, before he could get another chance to earn one. That said, his journey in this bout would be made extra difficult, as Vince McMahon had given him the #1 entry spot. Of course, with Shawn Michaels still acting as the on-screen commissioner back then, he was able to even the odds slightly when he booked Vince himself to enter the bout at #2. So like that, for the first time ever, Austin and McMahon were finally going to square off one-on-one, if only for a few minutes. But while this was cathartic for both Stone Cold and his fans, by the end of the night, he'd be screwed over once more, as after getting laid out by Vince's corporation cronies and from there spending much of the match in an ambulance, the fan favorite would be able to make his return, only to get dumped out by Vince himself while he was being distracted by The Rock. That said, for as grim as this made things look, hope would return, when the next night on Raw, McMahon, who had won the entire Rumble as a result of eliminating Austin, would relinquish his shot at the title at WrestleMania 15. Because he did this though, it meant the person who came second would automatically become the #1 contender instead, and since this man was none other than Steve Austin, it left the corporation suddenly having to regroup. How did they do this? Well, in a last-ditch effort to stop Stone Cold from challenging The Rock at the Showcase of the Immortals, the boss would agree to face his rival inside a steel cage at February 14th's St. Valentine's Day Massacre in your house, with the stipulation here being that, if he could win, Austin would forfeit his title shot. And so that was how, on Valentine's Day 1999, Austin and McMahon finally went one-on-one in a full-blown match. But while this would mostly see the Rattlesnake beat the ever-loving hell out of his employer, things would take a turn for the worst when, towards the end of the bout, the Big Show debuted by bursting out from under the ring. Unfortunately though, while he was establishing himself as a heel by tossing the #1 contender around like a child, he'd accidentally throw him into the cage so hard that he broke it, allowing the fan favorite to simply drop down to victory. And with this victory then, it meant that the following month at WrestleMania 15, Steve Austin would finally get to go one-on-one with The Rock for the WWF title. So, to fully show the corporation what he had in store for them then, on the March 22nd episode of Raw, just 6 days before WrestleMania, the Rattlesnake came down to the ring in a Coors truck and delivered a now iconic beer bath to the entire heel faction. But while many at the time thought that the match which followed and the Texans' eventual victory during it would mark the end of the Austin vs. McMahon saga, it still proved to have some legs left in it by the time it was all said and done. Yes, not wanting to kill the golden goose quite yet, WWF would keep the angle going by having Vince book The Rock to get a rematch with Stone Cold at April 25th's Backlash. That said, by then he had other problems to deal with, as with The Undertaker and his Ministry of Darkness threatening a hostile takeover of the company, he'd be forced to spread himself too thin, all of which led to Austin coming out victorious at the pay-per-view. And seeing how distracted his rival had become with the whole situation after that, Stone Cold would even begin to develop something which almost equated to sympathy for the boss, as, when The Undertaker kidnapped Stephanie McMahon on the April 26th episode of Raw, he'd be the one to save the billion-dollar princess. Of course, any chance of the two finally putting their issues to bed would be stalled when, just 2 weeks after Shane McMahon helped to screw Austin out of the WWF title during a match with the Deadman at May 23rd's Over the Edge, Vince would reveal that he'd been the higher power behind the demonic heel faction all along, and that the whole thing had been another attempt to get in the head of the Texan. But while for some, this was the point the storyline jumped the shark, others would be only too happy to watch along still, as mere minutes after the boss laid out his dastardly plan, Linda and Stephanie McMahon would come out to enact their revenge. How would they do this? Well, by announcing that they had each given up their 25% ownership of the company to none other than Stone Cold himself. And as a result of that, it meant the Rattlesnake was now majority owner of the WWF. So in the weeks following this, Austin would go full comedy cartoon character in the best possible way as he began showing up at Titan Towers in cut-off jeans and a necktie, making sweeping changes to the company culture by instituting things such as boardroom drinking competitions. On top of that, he'd also shift a percentage of Shane McMahon's paycheck over to Mick Foley, teach the receptionists a new way of answering the phone, and then finish things off by dumping a wheelbarrow full of manure in Vince's office. Needless to say then, the McMahons weren't going to take this lying down, and so, in order to get full control of their company back, they'd challenge Austin to a winner-takes-all handicap ladder match at June 27th's King of the Ring, with the stipulation here being that, if they won, they'd regain complete power once more. That said, there was little hope they'd be able to beat their foe in a straight-up fight, even with it being 2-on-1. So, in order to ensure victory then, they'd have a mystery man raise the briefcase containing control of WWF right as the Rattlesnake was about to grab it on the night of the match. Then, once they were able to briefly take Austin down, the briefcase would be lowered enough for them to simply take it and win the bout. But even this wasn't enough to end the Austin vs. McMahon feud because, with neither man willing to give up completely, it felt very much like they were destined to do this forever. So that was why, in the weeks following, Vince McMahon would speak to the former WWF champion in the ring and explain to him that, for the good of both of them, this had to end. And the only way to do this, as far as he saw it, would be to have an end-of-an-era match at the next big pay-per-view, fully loaded on July 25th. Why would this be the end of an era? Well, it wouldn't see Austin take on McMahon directly, it would see him challenge the boss's final surrogate, The Undertaker. But that wasn't all, because in an added stipulation, if Austin did indeed pick up the victory on this night, Vince agreed that he would leave WWF forever. If, however, The Undertaker won instead, then the Texas Rattlesnake would never be allowed to challenge for the top prize again. Yes, one way or another, it was going to end at Fully Loaded, and with this also being a first blood match, it meant someone was going to be busted open come the closing bell too. So despite it being a B-show, when the time for the bout finally came, anticipation was at an all-time high as fans waited to see how the year-and-a-half-long saga would conclude. Of course, in hindsight, there was no way Austin was going to be frozen out of the title scene forever. And so it really should have come as little surprise that he drew the Phenom's blood to win the match after just under 16 minutes. Then, with this done and with him back on top of the mountain again, the next night on Raw, the new champ would come out to the ring to confront the boss and offer him a less than fond farewell when he had Jim Ross lead a sing-along of Steam's "Na Na Hey Hey Kiss Him Goodbye." And just like that, the greatest storyline in wrestling history was over, with the babyface standing tall and the heel being vanquished forever. Right? Well, not quite, because while, yes, this would mark the end of the story being a focus on WWF TV, by the summer, Vince McMahon would have returned after Austin allowed him to do so, under the condition he give him a shot at the belt he had by then lost to Triple H. And at this point, it even looked like things might have continued with the two acting as tense babyface allies for a while. Of course, we'll never know if this would have happened because in November, the Rattlesnake was written out of TV for almost a year so as to go get neck surgery. And when he did return in September of 2000, there was no more focus really given to the Austin McMahon saga, as they were largely doing their own things by then. That was until WrestleMania 17, of course, because that night, on April 1st, 2001, the true ending to the feud would come when Stone Cold turned to the dark side and aligned himself with the boss. Of course, no one wanted to see this at the time, and as a result, the boom period would pretty much end overnight. But that's quite fitting in a way, because if it was this angle which was largely responsible for kicking off the Attitude Era in the first place, then it felt right it should also mark the ending of it too. To this day, in fact, it's probably a thing most commonly identified with the most popular mainstream period in the industry's history. And the reason for that is because, while it was such a simple story of good versus evil, the working man versus corporate America, and rebellion against anyone trying to hold you down, it had so many different beats layered throughout it during that year-and-a-half period that it never once got boring. Hell, so good was it, WWE have been trying to recreate it with every other top babyface for the last 20 years. That said, they've never been able to top the original, and they likely never will, as when it comes right down to it, nothing was ever as much fun to watch as Austin vs. McMahon, the tale of a working-class hero and his never-ending quest to rage against the machine.